Miss Janine, thank you for
Nolan.
being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
In beautiful Missoula, Montana,
Yes.
where you have been a native for how long?
Actually
Or
I
not a
live in the
native.
I live in the Bitterroot Valley.
Okay.
Yeah, for 34 years.
Wow.
I live about an hour south of here
Okay.
in a town called Stevensville.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So and we talked earlier, this is the Five Valleys or something?
It's the five valleys that come in. Yep, and we're in what's considered the Northern Rockies, and the biggest range around here is the Bitterroot Range.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
It's absolutely beautiful. When you're flying into the Missoula airport, what is that range that you can see out of the window? Do you know?
Well, it depends on where you're coming from.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah, it depends on where you're coming from. There's a really big range called the Mission Range.
Maybe that's it.
Which if it's almost Teton-like. Is that the one you're thinking about?
I think so, yeah, because I remember being like, that's a pretty stark mountain range. Just because like even some of these over here are a little bit more mellow, and that
Yeah.
one's pretty stark.
Yeah.
Where are you from originally?
New Jersey.
Okay.
Yeah, I was born in New York City,
Okay.
actually. My parents were both born in the city, and immigrant grandkid. And so yeah, Ellis Island
Wow.
to the city, and then off to New Jersey.
And then when you were a kid, if I said, hey, you're going to live outside of Missoula, what would you have said?
You know, it's interesting. I was always a nature kid, and even in the suburbs, you can find nature. And my parents knew enough about me to know that I needed some wild spaces behind me. And so they kept moving us farther and farther and farther from the city, just like the suburbs would roll over us, right? And they'd say, okay, time to move Diane and Janine, because they like to roam.
Yeah.
And so I think, I didn't know where I would be, but I knew I would be someplace as close as possible to the big heart of nature.
Yeah, which is, I mean, you found that place, that's for sure.
I did.
Right now, Biomimicry 3.8, but I kind of want to go back to the beginning of that because it's such an incredible idea. I'm curious, what were the building blocks before that kind of came into play, that idea that biomimicry in general became like the focus of your life? What were the building blocks that brought you to that point?
Yeah. Well, actually, I am a natural history writer. And I've always wanted to be a writer, and I always loved the natural world, and I thought there is no better subject than life itself to write about. So and at that point, this is like, long time ago, there wasn't a master's degree in science writing or anything like that. So I basically took a forestry degree, a full-on forestry degree, and then I took a full-on 4-year English literature degree. I actually took them at the same time, and put those together. And I said, I want to read at that point the Western canon, all the way from the Greeks. Actually, I want to read the best stories ever told, and the ones that have lasted in our tradition, and learn to be a good storyteller, because I have a heck of a story to talk about.
Yeah.
And then
sure.
I want to learn about, I took forestry not because I wanted to cut down trees, but because I wanted to know an ecosystem from roots to shoots and all the organisms in this complex adaptive system. And forestry really is a good way to learn one ecosystem. And I figured if I could learn a forest, I could learn about prairies or corals, or I'd get that kind of ecosystem level view of peering deeply into the places that I love. And then I would tell other people those stories, right, about life, so they'd love it as much as I do. And so I went to work right out of college for the Forest Service.
Where did that take you?
I had started as a co-op student, going down to DC, and where Forest Service headquarters is at the USDA. And I wound up staying there because they kept asking me to come back, and I was like, fine. And so I would delay another semester of school, and I wound up there at the information shop, and I was supposed to sort of be rotated around, and Xerox for a week, and, you know what I mean? And
all the fun stuff.
learn how to edit a newsletter for a week and all that sort of stuff. But I wound up befriending the speechwriter for the chief of the Forest Service, a guy named Len Carey. And Len and I got to know one another, and he said, "Oh my gosh, you can write." So he said, why don't I give you some notes, and why don't you try writing a speech for the chief of the Forest Service?
That's awesome.
Yeah. And
Did you end up writing a speech?
I did.
Wow.
And Len looked at it and he changed it a bit, and we talked about it, and the chief gave that speech. And what was really interesting is that, this is the chief of the U.S. Forest Service. It's, millions and millions of acres of land in our country. And the speeches were policy setting speeches. In other words, he was delivering them to people like testimonies in front of Congress, or he was delivering them to the Society of American Foresters and saying, this is where the U.S. Forest Service is going. So Len and I were deep ecologists. And there was a lot of things that we put into those speeches that wound up coming out of his mouth.
Yeah.
And we'd sit there in the audience and go, oh my God, he said that.
And that's what y'all wrote.
That's what we wrote. So that's when I started to realize that phrase, the pen is mightier than the sword.
Sure.
In this case, it was mightier than the chainsaw.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah.
So how long were you there?
I was there as a co-op student in D.C. for altogether about a year and a half. And so I was living down in D.C. And then I've gone back and forth to college. And then I graduated from there, and I went to work for the Forest Service Research in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I kept on writing. And then I got to know, it's amazing what mentorship really has been in my life. I got to know the head of the North Central Forest Experiment Station, who also realized in some way I had written a newsletter or written something, and he said, oh, you can write,
Another green light, another
green light, another person who saw me. And so he began to give me assignments, and then one day he said, what do you really want to do? And I said, he said, come up with a few proposals. And I said, what I really want to do is I want to write books. I want to write books. And so I came up with this proposal, and this was a long, long time ago, back in the 80s. And he said, okay. And he asked my best friend, which one does she want? Because I came up with 3 proposals for 3 books. And so he would choose the right one. And I also asked to work at home. And I also asked for...
That was before it was cool.
Yeah, that way before. And you didn't do that as a government employee. And I also asked for this newfangled thing called a laptop. So he looked at that, and he looked at my request. I had 3 things on a piece of paper, and he pushed the piece of paper back to me, and he said, okay, but get me a laptop too.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And people open doors for you. And he certainly did. And so I did. I worked at home, and I wrote a book called Northwoods Wildlife, A Wildlife Watcher's Guide to Habitats, for the Forest Service. And then I came and I told him, writing is my life.
I can't go back.
I can't go back. And he said, good for you. I'll see you on the bookshelves, And then I got a contract for my first 2 books with Simon & Schuster. And then I just continued to write books. Biomimicry was my 6th book.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So I'm a natural history writer. And what I was writing about was, this is the building blocks were me over a decade reading and writing about, if you do a field guide I did a field guide to wildlife habitats of the U.S. then, after I did Northwoods Wildlife. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
And it was a field guide organized by habitat, which was really unusual. I was the kind of kid and adult still who I have a backpack full of books, one to mushrooms, one to plants,
Yeah.
one to animals, right? One to birds. So I said, that's not really how we experience the natural world. We experience it one habitat at a time. And there's a certain group of species who live in a ponderosa pine forest or in a cattail marsh. And why don't I just do it by habitat? And then when you go to that place, this book will tell you who to look for and where to look for them.
And how they're interacting and things like
How
that.
they're interacting. So it was an ecologist's guide to these habitats. And I had to travel all over the United States to do that book.
That's a pretty good, that's a pretty big positive.
Yeah.
Going to see some cool places throughout the country.
It was awesome. It was awesome. And I knew the Forest Service, by this time I had left, but I knew wildlife biologists, and I knew that they had this magic trick, and it was called search image. Do you know what that is?
Like on Google?
Well, it's a particular biological thing. It's called a search image. So a predator, say a lynx, is a predator of a snowshoe hare. So a lynx has a search image for a snowshoe hare that is just even the outline or the outline of an ear. They know snowshoe hare the minute they see the tiniest hint, because they have a search image for snowshoe hare. They're looking for it. So my thought was and when you go out with wildlife biologists, you see so much wildlife because they have a search image. They know, if I look on the trunk, I'm going to see a pileated because I'm in an old ponderosa pine stand. I might see a flammulated owl, which will be slightly above the pileated. And then in the branches, there might be a pine siskin. And they're looking for that. And so they see it. And I said, well, why don't I give the readers a search image for these organisms? Tell them where they're going to be breeding and feeding and flying. And so that my hope was that, like a wildlife biologist who can sit in a habitat and be totally happy for hours.
Because there's so many things going on.
So many things they see. I wanted to give people those eyes.
It's much like the analogy, a lot of people, I played baseball growing up, and people would be like, baseball's so boring. And for somebody, I understand that viewpoint, but it's for the uninitiated, the people that don't know the nuance of what's going on. So you can look at the game and be like, all they do is run, hit, and steal, or run, hit, and throw. But then somebody that knows the game, you see the pre-pitch movement of the third baseman because they think he's going to bunt, or the pitch call after a certain pitch that was swung at a certain way. And you see all these different nuances, and then it becomes really interesting. So it kind of seems like the same type of deal.
It's really good, Nolan, because you're right. You are looking with different eyes.
Sure.
You're looking for a twitch on that third baseman, or, somebody making a sign to somebody. I don't even see that, right? But you know enough about the system and how it works together, this complex system, and this play, and it becomes engrossing and fascinating to you. And there's so many of us who walk through the natural world as if we're inside a pretty calendar or something, and it's just scenery, right? And I wanted people to have that experience of falling in love with the natural world, which means slowing down enough to understand that, hey, you're walking through a neighborhood. And, that's how, as a little kid, I used to experience the ravine in my backyard, the old field near me. I got to know those organisms as families. I knew when they were breeding. I knew when, oh my gosh, they're going to have, the baby rabbits are going to be here soon. And it was like I was coming to a neighborhood and anticipating, what was going to happen next. Like, that butterfly is probably going to be out of the chrysalis today. That kind of love and care for something, that kind of noticing, what it does is it dissolves the boundary, the false boundary between me and the rest of the natural world. Because if you watch organisms, for instance, having a family and then fledging their young, and you watch the hooded mergansers hop out of the pileated woodpecker hole and little tiny hooded mergansers and they bounce their little fluff balls, but you've watched the whole drama.
Mhm.
You may have even seen the mating happening, the mating calls. And here's, when that happens, you say, oh, these living beings are putting their kids to bed at night.
Yeah, just like a human.
Just like us.
Yeah.
And they have to have a safe space for them. So they architect, they build nests, they create materials.
They communicate, they interact with each other.
They have to have they have to find energy, they have to find food, they have to find water and shelter. And they're building a life. And they're actually co-creating their habitat, which is really cool. Just by being there, they change their habitat. And that, I think, is the basis really of biomimicry for me, because biomimicry is learning something from the natural world in order to solve a problem that you have, right? So for me, it was not unusual to read about a toxic chemical on my raincoat and then stand outside in the pouring rain and watch the water run off ducks' backs, literally, and say, well, that's not toxic chemicals. Why are they waterproof? Why haven't we asked them? And then look around and, oh my gosh, there's, all of the trees, all the leaves, the water's balling up and it's leaving the leaf. And as it leaves the leaf, it cleans the leaf. It's picking up dirt particles. It's self-cleaning. Like, why are we using chemicals to clean things? Like everything in nature, every leaf has to stay clean to photosynthesize. When you start to have that false boundary disappear, that's when I think biomimicry became a question for me. It wasn't yet a field. So I just started to say to myself, I've written all these books about how plants and animals fit into their habitats. It's full of adaptations, meaning it's full of technologies, natural tools for living. Is anyone trying to consciously emulate these organisms? And so I think that's a long answer to say the building blocks were me not being separate from the natural world, but understanding that I basically formed an incredible respect for them.
Yeah. And then that respect more or less drove you to learn. Like you have the search image, so you're looking, you know what to look for. But then even one step further is, okay, I know what I'm looking at or looking for, but what can I learn from?
Yes.
And the raincoat example is a perfect example. I remember years ago when my dad first mentioned biomimicry or your name or whatever it was, the spiderweb example. It's like so a spider can take whatever's in its body and then the things in its immediate surroundings and make something that square inch by square inch is stronger than steel, correct?
Yeah, 5 times stronger than steel, ounce for ounce.
And then you think about what it takes for a human being to create steel. It's just one of those things like, okay, well, how the curiosity is where you really have to start. You have to be curious, and perhaps the respect is a good word, because if you have respect for it, then you'll be curious about what you can learn from it. But if it's not like,
that's it.
If there is no respect, then you'll kind of write off the lessons that it may be able to impart.
That's right. And I think, Western industrial culture, we forgot. I think people used to be they had a lot of admiration for the organisms they were, watching, even indigenous peoples and even people like the Wright brothers were watching turkey vultures and went, oh, how does drag and lift work? And could we do something like that? I think there was a time when biomimicry was pretty natural. Alaskan hunters Inuit hunters they still fish or hunt for seals the way polar bears do. So polar bears sneak up to a hole, the Weddell seal is in a hole, and they sneak up to a hole and they actually cover their black nose. So they're all white then. And they sneak up, and so do Inuit hunters. They sneak up to that hole. Well, they watched the polar bear do that, right? Because they realized,
we need
we need some food, and this is a great predator. Polar bears are rolling around. They look like they're well fed, right? Like, what do they do? And I think we just forgot to ask that question. What do they do?
That's yeah. What do they do? That's an interesting because I'm fascinated by American Indians and the interaction between them and bison in general. I think bison are freaking incredible, and just the whole rise and fall of them in America, and
Yes.
just how before market hunting became a thing, how they were very much so a part of the ecosystem. It wasn't like they were a separate thing and then they had to kind of grab their hand in and then take some bison and then take some bison. They were moving with it. They were traveling with them and like interacting with the environment the same way or in a different way, but in the same environment with them.
Yes.
And it's very fascinating to me to look at it through that lens of like, okay, well, what did they do? I wonder if they maybe looked at a bear or a wolf or some other type of animal. Like how do they get bison and stuff like that? But
I'm sure they did.
Intuitively. And I actually want to come back to that because we were having a discussion last night about what we can learn from native people. So biomimicry, was that word a thing before you came to it, or did you kind of say, okay, biomimicry?
Yes.
And then you sort of glued the two together?
I did. You got to go way back. I started collecting for the book in 1990 when I asked that question. Is there anybody in the sciences who is consciously trying to emulate life's genius? Like, is there and the first paper I ever found was it was the scientists at Arizona State University, and they were studying photosynthesis, which is how leaves capture energy and turn it into light into life, and light into chemistry. And they were saying, well, isn't this is the most ubiquitous energy system on the planet? Shouldn't we be making solar cells like this? And we weren't at all. Nobody had looked at leaves to try to mimic them. So I found that paper. I Xeroxed it because it was
because you learned how to do that.
I learned how to do that, exactly. And I'd come up to the University of Montana where we're sitting here, come up to the library, and I'm a big nerd. And so I'd go through the, beginning of the month was exciting for me because Science and Nature magazine were out, and I would come up and read articles that interested me. And I was working on a book at the time, and then in the back of my mind, I always had this question. So I started wool gathering for it, so I'd Xerox that paper. And then I wound up filling a file folder, and I had to name the file folder. And I went to the dictionary. I had one of these big, Oxford dictionaries because I'm a nerd, word nerd. And bio means life, and mimesis in Greek means to imitate. And I thought biomimesis had been used for material science, very niche thing. And so I thought, mimicry, it's more like biomimicry. And I wrote that on the folder.
And the rest is history.
Yeah. And then the folder became a whole file drawer, and I was working on another book, and I walked past, it was like one of these Hun file cabinets. I walked past it was filled with papers, and I said, that's a field. That's an emerging discipline that has no name. Right? Like, there's something going on here. And so I started to do the Tyro experience, and I started to call these scientists up and say, can I come and learn from you? Help me get smarter about this. And I started traveling around to meet them, the ones that were in these papers doing this work. And the interesting thing was, some of them were doing material science, learning from spider silk or rhino horns or abalone shells. Some were doing agriculture, like Wes Jackson, the Land Institute, studying prairies to come up with models for what we would now call regenerative ag, right? He was looking, prairies have polycultures, more than one species in the field. Legumes are in the mix to help fertilize it, and they're perennial.
Yep.
They're not annual, right? So they hold the soil down. So he was looking at prairies as a model. People were looking at whole forest ecosystems as a model for business. People were looking at how do organisms self-medicate? How do they go off and find a particular kind of plant, and how can we learn from them how they keep themselves well? And all of these fields. I mean, it was building and chemistry and material science, but all of these fields had different names, and so natural science, what was it called? Natural ag, what was Wes Jackson's natural science agriculture, I think, NSA, and then zoopharmacognosy was the animal self-medications.
And so all they were different fields, but they were in the same vein. They just weren't united
in the
yet.
same vein.
But they had the same ethos, I guess would be the word.
Exactly. There were people in computing that were learning from immune systems, and yeah, they didn't. The thing is, the golden thread among them was that they were all looking to the natural world as model and as measure and mentor, but they didn't know. They didn't know about each other. First of all, I'd go to one, and I'd say, "Do you know about the people who are doing this kind of biomimicry?" They're like, "What is that? What's biomimicry?"
Well, because there's no Instagram or Twitter or even there's no internet published science journals or nature journal. There was none of that.
There wasn't. Now there are. I think the fourth one just came out around biomimicry and biomimetics. Very cool. Yeah, there were no journal articles. There wasn't a name that they all called each other. So the people doing material science and the people doing, industrial ecology didn't know each other. And
so you were trying to weave the pieces together. And another note on that, you said the Tyro experience and calling up people. It's funny how many people say yes. It's surprising to a lot of people when you just call people to talk, and a lot of times they say yes if you're eager and curious enough.
They do.
So you now have this file cabinet of papers, and you look at it and you say, okay, I need to do something. Yeah. Did the book come out of the traveling and talking with the other scientists? Did it kind of evolve at the same time, or did it come after?
How did that all tie together? Called my agent and I said, I have a book. I have another book. And it's slightly different because most of my books had been essentially biology books, right? And I said, this one's about a new field. It's about a new innovation practice. It's about like a whole lens of how to look at the natural world as a teacher instead of as a warehouse. She was like, what are you talking about?
She's gone mad.
She's gone mad. So then I just started to give her examples of, of the ways that people are starting to learn from these organisms of how to do chemistry and how they might build in a different way. And there were a few examples here and there. And people like Leonardo da Vinci had done this, right? There were people in history who had his notebooks are full of natural models that he then tried to mimic in a helicopter or, right?
Yeah.
But they would kind of pop up, Buckminster Fuller, they'd pop up and then they would sort of die out. Like there was no body of work around them. And so I think that's why it didn't have a name really. It didn't have there were several people doing it. But once you told people, like I told other people in the book, that other people are looking to nature in the same way. And they're finding new kinds of models and they're really excited about it, And
then they can connect like, hey, what are you learning from here? And then what are you learning from this system and all that? And this,
exactly.
In this field, that's fascinating.
And then it's amazing language, the power of naming something and being able, for humans, being able to point to it. It's almost like
it's unifying.
It's unifying.
There's a Ansel Adams, I believe, the photographer, if I'm not mistaken. This quote is attributed to him, but if you don't know where you're going, then any road will get you there. So if you don't have the destination, then it's like, then you're just aiming. You're aimless.
Right. That's right.
But when you have that thing, biomimicry, and then you have the 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 or dozen different fields that are all sort of the same ethos as that, but are kind of like misfits in their own field. And they're like, oh wait, yeah, biomimicry, that's what we're doing. And then they all come together.
Exactly. It was a way for people to find each other for sure. I'm also looking at natural models. And then you can begin to say, well, is there a way we can gather natural models, gather biological intelligence, if you will, by function, So everything that we've done since has been in service of trying to equip the practitioners of this new and emerging discipline, the biomimics.
That's what you call them,
Yeah,
biomimics?
biomimics.
Very
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
Is there any specific examples? You gave the leaf example with the photosynthesis, but early on, was there any examples when you're going through these papers or talking to these people that you're like, mind blown, holy cow, this is such a cool thing that you're learning? Is there any examples of those that really stick out?
I mean, I have to say that in the early days, scientists knew about climate change, 40, 50 years ago, we were talking about it. And we knew that there was this overabundance of CO2 in the air. So when I began to meet people like Brent Constance, who had studied coral reefs and how they make cement-like or concrete-like reefs, and I asked him, well, they're calcium carbonate. Where does the carbon come from? He said, CO2. It's dissolved CO2. I said, so he said, yeah. So I thought to myself, he thought to himself, he read a stat that said, in our making of our largest building material, which is concrete, we release a ton of CO2 for every ton of cement we make. He said, but I know that the coral reefs that I swim with are sequestering CO2 in their coral reefs.
But they're making a similar
material. And they're making it without a kiln. Just back to the spider. I mean, they have to create hard shells, bones, all those things, those minerals, they have to be created. Think of an elk antler.
Yeah.
The elk doesn't put its head in a kiln, in an oven, right?
Yeah.
To fire the cement, or the ceramic, rather. But believe me, it's making a very tough ceramic. How does it do that? So he said, what if I take CO2 from smokestacks and I use the same recipe as the coral reef and he does this, to bubble CO2 through water and then through seawater, because that's where the minerals will come from. Nowadays, he's using waste brine from desalination plants.
Wow.
So that's a waste material that's really packed with minerals. They're very condensed, right? And that brine has all the minerals you need. And then the CO2 and the coral reef's recipe, which has some magnesium in it, it's a very interesting chemical process, out precipitates the raw materials for concrete. In fact, if you go to the terminal, the new Harvey Milk Terminal at San Francisco Airport.
Is it made using that?
It's made using Blue Planet is his new company. It's all the rock and all the aggregate. Can you imagine not having to dig up limestone, which is what we normally do? We go to a mine, we dig up limestone, we heat it at really high temperatures in order to get the clinker, to get the cement part. And that limestone cliff, that's just the bodies of diatoms and ancient shelled organisms. So that's what we used to do. That's the old way of doing it. But to borrow the coral reef's recipe and have that material precipitate out at room temperature, I mean, it's brilliant. But the thing is that organisms have been using CO2. Every plant we have that we're looking at here is using CO2 to make chemistry. So that was a blow away for me. I thought,
that's pretty
God,
incredible.
that's the paradigm. And people weren't talking about climate change yet, but I thought, well, CO2 is a building block. It's not a poison. We think of it as a poison, toxic thing because there's too much of it. But to be plant-like or coral-like, we should start using it to make things, right?
That's
and
incredible.
and the thing is that chemistry's already been invented.
You just need, what would be the challenge or the drawback for more mass adoption of something like that? Just getting the word out, or is it more expensive? Is it less expensive, or what's the drawback? Because it sounds like building, I mean, an airport in San Francisco is a pretty big project.
It's a big project. Well, for that, to get into the concrete business, it's such an established business. It's our largest building material by far that we use around the world. And there are some very large established companies that have the market share right now. And building is a conservative business, thankfully, because we don't want buildings to fall on our heads, right? So a lot of the barriers are around that. But then you have incentive, you have pull. So suddenly when California had sort of a policy landscape that said we have to reduce our CO2 emissions and actually try to pull down carbon dioxide from the air, legacy carbon dioxide. How can we become carbon negative, as they say, right? How can we sequester carbon? Suddenly that became the incentive for a new kind of concrete. He still has to make sure it's strong enough and it costs, and the costs are that there's cost parity. That still has to happen. But sometimes there's an opening, which is why, civil society is so important to these new innovations seeing the light of day.
Is there any other examples that you can think of biomimicry manifesting itself into the built environment, like the concrete?
Yeah, of course. Yes, there's a lot. There's a really cool one that I care a lot about because I'm an ecologist. But have you heard of Ornolux windows?
I've not.
This is a cool one because it goes back to our spider friend. So a lot of billions of birds are killed, smashing into windows. They can't see the window. They basically don't see it, and they smash into it. So there's a German company that makes these windows, and what they said to themselves was, how is it that spiders build a web, right? Why isn't it that birds are rarely seen breaking through a spider's web? It would be super expensive for a spider to make a web, right? And then a bird to crash through it every day, right? So why doesn't that happen? So what happens is that the spider they can make up to 6 or 7 different kinds of silk. So they mix a different kind of silk, and they mix a silk into their thread that reflects UV light. And birds can see UV light. Wow. So that's how spiders protect themselves from getting hit by birds. So this company puts in these very, very small, the human eye can't see it, strands in a web-like pattern, these strands of UV light reflecting, kind of like the decals, except it's deep in the glass itself.
Wow.
There's also I talked about self-cleaning leaves. There's a paint called Lotusin paint, and it's based on the lotus leaf, which grows in a really muddy place, and yet it's the symbol of purity in Asia, the lotus plant, right? But the leaves if you look at them under a high-powered microscope, they have these little bumps, it looks like mountain ranges if you look at it up really, really close. And what happens is, and they're kind of waxy, what happens is that when rain falls, it actually balls up sort of on the mountaintops. And so do particles of dirt. And so they're sitting there kind of teetering on the mountaintops. And then as the leaf tilts, the ball of water purls off. It picks up the dirt particles as it's rolling off. And so it cleans the leaf day after day after day. It just keeps on cleaning
no
that
waste,
leaf.
No waste, no waste.
No waste. So somebody in Germany, a group said, well, why don't we put that texture into paint? Same texture. It's basically it's how many nanometers apart, the bumps are, how high the bumps are. And so they experimented. They have a paint that's called Lotusin and hundreds of thousands of buildings in Europe now have it. Cool. And it's just, there's an office now in Atlanta, actually.
Wow.
It's Stowe is the company, STO. Anyway, when you paint, it dries. And as it dries, it has these little bumps. And you can't see them with your eye. It looks like regular paint. But rainwater cleans the building. So no sandblasting.
Wow.
Right? No algae streaks down the buildings.
No chemicals
No chemicals
need to be used. That's incredible.
No. So the building cleans itself with rainwater.
And that's a direct, that's like a direct, it's directly using a lesson that you're exactly right. Look at the leaf. Yeah.
It's a blueprint. It literally is like,
say, how can we do that?
Magnify it, make a 3D model of it. Yeah, it's exactly. And then there's things that biomimicry is everywhere. Like in a building, especially a commercial building, you've got beams in the building. And those beams, and on bridges and things like that, and even in the chassis of cars. What engineers are doing now to design those, they want to minimize the amount of material use that they have, say, in a steel beam. And so there's this software program that removes material that's not needed. So all you're left with is all the strength with a minimum of material. But it comes from the way our bones, it's a bone algorithm, it's called.
Wow.
So the way our bones, when you're running in baseball, right, your bones are constantly reacting to lines of stress. So as an athlete, because you are stressing your bones in a particular way, your bones are getting stronger along the lines of stress. And because minerals in your body are precious, what your body does is it breaks down minerals where they're not needed and then bulks up where they are needed. And that's why your bones have that sort of cobwebby look,
Yeah.
right? If you cut them, in cross section or whatever, that is actually an active response. It's demineralizing and remineralizing. So what they did was, this was a company called Altier Engineering in Michigan, and a guy named Jeff Brannon was a bone researcher. And he came to Altier Engineering for like a lunch and learn because he was a professor next door, and really changed how building is done and how a lot of construction engineering is how things are designed. Because he sat there and he told them about this bone stuff, and they said, could you put that into an algorithm? Could you make an optimization software program that does the same thing? And he said, yeah. So they hired him.
Very cool.
And it's called topological optimization. And so that is inside there's a version of that. The first one was called OptiStruct. It's, if you're an engineer and you're building something, you use a CAD/CAM program to digitally design it. And there's optimization programs in that. And no matter what company you're talking about, they all have a version now of the bone algorithm. So you can't walk past a big commercial building or even be in a car chassis without probably having biomimicry helped design it. Your own bone process helped design it.
Yeah, because that's so cool to hear, because the excess waste, like, so it's all the structure without the unnecessary whatever it is.
Yep.
And one of the things I know that you talk about is nature using the least amount of energy necessary.
That's right.
And so that'd be a prime example of that.
Only what's necessary.
Exactly.
Only what's needed. Fitting form to function. So that's a real good example of fitting form to function. The function is I gotta beef up in this particular form in order to handle the kinds of stresses I usually get, because now I'm a baseball player, right? So I'm gonna fit the form now. I'm gonna remodel all my bones to fit that form, which is pretty cool. But when you think about it from a sustainability standpoint, if something is lighter, you don't need as much material. So you don't need to mine as much. But then it's lighter, and then when you transport that beam or whatever, it takes less fossil fuels to transport it, right? And that means less CO2 emissions. And so lightweighting is a very powerful way that the natural world, you look at bird bones and
they would
they
never
know
make
how to
something
lightweight.
as heavy as possible. They would make it as light as possible every time.
Exactly. It's a really interesting, and these are some of the paradigms that it makes engineers go, huh, or designers go, interesting, because materials are precious, meaning they're expensive to make. Living organisms will, a palm tree would rather bend in the wind and allow the wind to move through it rather than just bulk up like we do, right? They bend. In fact, there's a guy named Steve Vogel who's done a bunch of work looking at trees in really windy places, like live oaks down in New Orleans, right? And what he has found when he puts them, really slow motion cameras, when the wind's coming, there's a lot of things going on in that tree. The tree has a spiral. Its fibers are spiraled in the trunk and also in the branches, which allows it to flex a little. So it's flexing. And then also the leaves themselves when he puts it into a camera and then really slows it down, he can see the leaves. Think of those big live oak leaves. They actually form a funnel. They curl and form a funnel, which is exactly the mathematics of the Fibonacci sequence that you've heard about in Dan Brown's books and stuff. That Fibonacci sequence is a mathematical formula, but it's in the shape. It's the shape that flow likes to go with the least friction. So it creates a funnel. Each leaf creates a funnel for the wind. The leaf is not like bending itself.
Yeah.
The wind is bending it, but it's shaped in such a way so that it creates a funnel for the wind to flow through it rather than tear the leaves off.
Wow.
Right? Until that very biggest hurricane when off go the leaves and off go the branches. And even then, the tree is, the trees, the live oaks around Lake Pontchartrain in Katrina, they lived.
Wow.
Only a few of them died, those big, giant live oaks. And one of the reasons is that their roots are grafted to each other underneath the ground. They're twined around each other.
Wow.
So when the hurricane hits, it doesn't hit one live oak.
All of them.
Hits them all. And they're acting as one. And then, they lose a lot of branches. They get stripped of all their leaves. But what ecologists have found is that that's this pulse of fertility, and that the tree actually has come to the point of depending on that. It's like getting a big old vitamin nourishment, because those things decay and feed right back into the roots.
Yeah.
So they're also designed to let go when they need to.
That's incredible. I'm sure there's dozens and dozens, if not more than that, of examples of that. I just find them so fascinating, because thinking about the bone example or even the window, how many of the things that we use or make in today's world are we not, or could we be making using less energy and even a more efficient, because there's the less energy to make them, but also more effective, also more powerful, also more useful for us. And when you say form, you're fitting form to function.
Yeah.
What would be the opposite of that? So what's an example of I guess, fitting function to form, or what would be the counter?
Well, it's kind of what you were saying, that we overbuild, right? We overbuild for the worst case scenario. And that's really not a good use of materials, right? It doesn't really consider function, the way the organism really has to live, right? It's doing it for the 1,000-year storm or something. Yeah. And maybe that's not the best way for us to, maybe bending or flexing might be better, in those cases. But what's interesting is that when we got fossil fuels, when we started digging up the dinosaurs, we got on the end of a very long lever, meaning there's so much energy in a barrel of oil. Highly dense, amazing amounts of energy, right? And so we started to say, well, yeah, we don't need to be so elegant with our design, because we can just add more stuff and push it with lots more energy. And now that we're getting to the point where the limits are starting to show themselves, right? That material is precious. We're hitting peak oil. We've got peak everything right now. And so as limits come into view for us, there's a life's principle that we talk about that's called life taps the power of limits. So organisms don't see limits as a negative per se, because what they say, what an organism, I mean, if it could talk to you, it would, or the reasoning goes through natural selection, of course. But what it is how do I look at the limits and the opportunities in my habitat, and then how do I dance within those parameters, right? And the better I am at working within those limits and taking advantage of those opportunities, the better adapted I am. And that means I get to stay, and my offspring gets to stay 10,000 generations from now, because I've learned how not to run away from limits or overcome limits, but to dance within them And that's what elegant design is all about. Like thinking of a limit as a creative frame, right? What can you do within that? So limits seem to me to be a human conception. I would think that, other organisms, to them, it's reality, just reality, just the way it is, right?
Yeah. And there is no creative. That's where creativity shows itself. There's not much creative, not much creativity is needed when there are no boundaries.
Right.
The creative.
That's well said.
Yeah. The creativity is from when you have to get something within a certain amount of constraints.
That's right.
Because then it's like, okay, well, how do I get X result with these opportunities or this amount of resources or this amount of energy within these constraints? That's right. That's fascinating.
That's right. So when we it's and even computer folks will tell you that when you started to have all the storage capacity or all the RAM in the world, like code got kind of redundant and a little sloppy and big. When you didn't, elegant code is when you don't have all of that space to be able to stretch out, and and we're, as those limits approach, that's, I think, when our designs will get really elegant and really, parsimonious with material and energy and multifunctional. That's the other thing that life does. It's that leaf that I told you about on the live oak is not just an energy dissipator for wind. It's a radiator. It radiates, it keeps the tree cool. It's photosynthesizing. It's a chemistry. It's a chemistry lab. It's a material science lab factory, right? It's doing all of these things for the plant, and it's multifunctional in one design. And I see the best designers find that beautiful.
Absolutely. It's in here, and I think I heard you say it maybe in a TED Talk or something, but having a biologist at the design table.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Is that sort of what you're talking about right now?
Yeah. So that's where biomimicry went. So when the book came out, I actually started to get calls from companies. I'm GE, I'm Nike, I'm General Mills, and I'm Ford. I'm designing things. I'm designing things all day long, and my designers and engineers are designing things. Could you send a biologist over? And I was in my pajamas writing my next book, literally writing my next book. And I just kept getting calls and calls and calls. And then I got a call from Dana Baumeister, my business partner, all these years ago. She was a postdoc here at the University of Montana, and or a PhD candidate, actually, at that point. She had read the book and she said, I want to do this. And I said, do what? She said, I read this book. I shook for 3 days. That internal shaking when you're really excited. She said, I want to do this. I said, oh, I don't know what you're talking about, but why don't you come to my house? And we hung out for about 11 hours. And we whiteboarded way back then. What would it take? I said to her, these companies are calling me. They want biologists at their design tables.
Which is unheard of.
So we just wrote that down. Biologists at the design table. That's BAT, B-A-D-T. That's the new career. So how do we find these biologists at the design table? Do they exist? No. Okay, first thing first, let's train some. Or let's think of the methodology ourselves. Like, how would you look into the biological literature through the lens of function and say, how does nature filter? Because there's not a book on filtering in the natural world. Science isn't organized by function. It's organized by, here are all the mushrooms, back to here are all the, you learn about mushrooms, or you learn about, you don't learn about across the tree of life. And this is what a biologist at the design table does. You start with a function, like you want to learn, maybe a big desalination company comes to you and says, how can we improve our membranes? And we say, well, what do you want your design to do? You want your design to recover fresh water from salty water. So we biologize the question and we say, okay, how does nature recover fresh water from water with concentrated stuff in it, right? And so then you start saying, well, what in the natural world does that? And it's like, especially around salt. And you're like, okay, well, how about mangroves? They live in salt water. Their roots are in salt water, but they live on fresh water, so they're desalinating all the time. What about fish? They're desalinating all the
Sea
time.
cucumbers, are those, or no, they don't do that.
Anything when you go into the ocean, all those living beings need fresh water in their cells. So every single one is a desalination plant.
Wow.
Yeah.
So a lot to learn from.
A lot to learn from. So what we do is a biologist at the design table looks across the tree of life and says, how does bacteria filter salt from water? How does fungi, are there any fungi who do it? How do they do it? How do plants do it? That's what I mean about across the tree of life. How do mammals do it? How do seabirds, the nasal glands of seabirds and your own kidneys, and right? And so then you start to read the biological papers and you see all the different kinds of mechanisms for filtering salt out of water. And none of them take 900 pounds per square inch of pressure and energy and push water against a membrane.
Yeah.
None of them do that. I mean, it's then what you do is you, as a biologist at the design table, you read all these, you come up with this wonderful, encyclopedia of cool mechanisms, and you begin to organize them to get them down to like 25, 30 cool ideas. You go to the engineer and you say, have you thought of this? Here's a lot of organisms seem to have two membranes. One has big holes in it, one has smaller holes in it, and they're up against each other in such and so way. That seems to be a pattern in the natural world. Have you ever tried that? No. But life had 3.8 billion years to evolve some of these things.
So that's where the biologist sort of, I guess, has that search image. They know what they're looking for. Whereas the engineer looks at the mangroves and is like, I don't know. I just know that they live. So the biologist would come and say, this organism does this. This organism does this. This organism does this. Same function.
Yes. Here's
the first principles of X function.
That's it.
Here's how you can implement it into whatever.
That's it.
That's remarkable.
That's it. Like, we've worked with about 150 companies and over the 25 years. And, somebody might come to us and say, okay, we need to whiten paper. We need to whiten teeth. We need to whiten paint. And we use titanium dioxide, and we mine it, and we want to get away from that. So what's the substitute for that? And we say, well, hold on, like maybe it's not a substitute. What do you actually want to do? What do you want your design to do? Not what do you want to design, like a new pigment. What do you want your design to do? You want it to create the color white to everyone's eyes. So we go into the natural world and we look at everything that's white.
That doesn't use titanium dioxide.
They don't use titanium. In fact, it's structural color. So it's a particular kind of color where it's not a pigment. It's not a white pigment. What it is like, for instance, there's these really white beetles. You look for the whitest things, right? There's these really white beetles in Asia. And if you look really close at their beetle scale, at their scales, their wing scales, you see all of these fibers they look like they're just a jumble of, straws or something on top of each other in a random pattern. And what happens is the light comes in and it scatters, creating the color white to your eye, complete scattering of light. So black is the absorption of white, and of light, and then white is the scattering. And turns out they scatter light better than anything else. So you look for the champion adapters, who really does it well. And then you look and you say, okay, well, what is it about those fibers? Is there anything that's this? And then you find another white organism and go, oh, they're doing fibers too. And then you say, it has to do with the ratio of how long it is to how narrow it is. I mean, it literally, we are like sleuths to try to uncover what, how did this, or how is this happening? And it turns out that there are some very simple things, like life is going to do it simply because
that beetle's not going to go mine titanium dioxide.
No, it's actually the thing that causes the white color is the same material that the beetle uses to make its hole body.
Wow.
So its legs are the same material. They're just in a different design. The shell is in the same. It's chitin.
Multifunctional, the material.
Exactly. So
Well,
when
and
you
I'm sure
lay
it
it
has
up,
some sort of like, it helps that animal with some sort of predatory protection or something like that, maybe blend
Yep.
into some sort of environment too.
it does. That's what it's doing for sure. It's camouflage for that organism, or it's trying to shed heat, just like we do reflective cool roofs or something to shed heat. But the thing is that the organism has, and so, its legs are rubbery and they can move and articulate. And one part of its shell is hard and abrasion resistant. And another part has this cool structural color going on. It's the same material system. It's the same material. So what's really amazing about that is that it can be broken down in the natural world. So this idea, another deep, deep pattern that we realized is that what life does, what the rest of life does, because we are nature, what the rest of life has learned to do is to take a material and add design to it, like lay it up in a weird sort of fibrous way with this kind of material and get the function through the design, whereas we tend to make a new material. So when you have a chip wrapper or something, right? For potato chips, you've got like 7 layers. One to exclude oxygen. Oh, another layer to put the print on. Another layer to have it be structurally strong so it doesn't get punctured. We do, like, if you need a new function, you do a new material, but then you can't recycle it. So what the beetle does is it uses the same material, adds design to it, to create the function, and then you can recycle the whole thing.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it's more efficient because it's only one material.
It's one material. It's a material system. Often they're composites. So it's like chitin and then another kind of protein in there. But and there's not that many polymer materials in the there's cellulose, there's rizolin, there's cartilage, that there's not that many. Chitin, which is like all shellfish and like crustaceans and all are chitin, and insects are chitin. So when you look at it, it's so different from us. We've got hundreds of thousands now of different kinds of polymers, and we can't recycle them.
Yeah.
Right. And
a lot of them are toxic to humans too.
Exactly. So when you really get to, like, what would the circular economy look like if we actually followed some of these biomimetic ideas, you would be using the same material or the same small palette of materials. Maybe there'd be 5 kinds of polymers. And maybe you would be using 3D printing or additive manufacturing in order to add this elegant design. Let's lay up this particular material, and maybe the material would be a waste material. It'd be waste cellulose, right? From yard clippings or something. Well, that's actually happening now. We also have an institute, a Biomimicry Institute, a nonprofit, and we do a design challenge. And there's a company called Impossible Materials that studied that Asian beetle and that takes cellulose, waste cellulose from anywhere. Cellulose is just like leaves, plants, yard clippings, wood is cellulose. Taken that, and then they found a way to process it in such a way that it creates those fibers.
Wow.
And so now it's a direct and then they can turn that into a powder. It's a direct plug-in to replace titanium dioxide.
Wow.
It's called Impossible Materials.
That's very cool.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a direct.
And they want our price. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's worthy. It sounds like.
Yeah.
What's been the 25 years you've been biomimicry? What's been, if there is one sort of breakthrough that stands out over that time that's really sort of catapulted the whole field or the whole idea? Has there been one or two that you can think of that's really been like, okay, this is really pushing momentum?
Everybody knows about Velcro, and I wish it was a different one. I
don't know about Velcro.
Velcro is that was the first one, and the first one people really thought about, or that know about. So a guy came back in a Swiss guy came back from walking his dog and noticed that. Have you ever walked your dog and you have the burrs, the seeds
Yeah.
that have all those hooks on them, and then you sit there and try to pull them off your socks and pull them off. Well, he was pulling them off his dog and went, "Hey, wait a minute, this is a cool adhesive idea, a non-glue adhesive idea." And so he created Velcro.
Wow.
He looked up close at that. Yeah. So that's one. But they're like, you're in your phone, you've got 2 microphones in your phone now that are very similar to the 2 ears that we have. What you have in most phones now is a noise canceling chip that mimics the auditory system in humans for noise canceling, how we get to talk to each other at a crowded cocktail party. And, there's a lot of things. When you go to the airport and you have that, that thing that you raise your arms up?
Yep.
That is called a millimeter wave detector. It's an acoustic camera. And it's done with these millimeter waves. And it's based on the echolocation of the Brazilian free-tailed bat.
Really?
Yeah. So that bat, how they put out an echolocation, call, and then it bounces off the moth, right? Well, they have a frequency that they use, multiple frequencies they're able to go, but it's of a particular wavelength. So those are called millimeter wave detectors. And to me, so many of us know that, and we don't know it's a biomimetic invention.
I had no idea.
And we don't, one of the things we're working on is something called innovation for conservation, where we're saying that the Brazilian free-tailed bat should be the first name on the patent because they're the inventor, and that royalties should go back to conserving the habitat of this organism because they invented right, with their human inventors, like in collaboration. There's other people on the patent that also deserve to be there, but that's what we're trying to work on now.
That's cool.
The next biodiversity COP will be going and trying to get that into some of the language, the benefit and asset sharing language.
What's I think I remember seeing in your book maybe 8. Are there any first principles that you could share to anybody that would like help them understand biomimicry, or how somebody comes to have that search image, I guess, if that makes sense? Like what are the first principles that people can learn and digest that would allow them to start potentially seeing things in their own environment, if anything?
I would give more of a, there's these things called life's principles. There's 26 of them that we use. And they're things like life cultivates cooperative relationships, and, life is locally attuned and responsive, and life does chemistry in water. So we have a whole list of those at biomimicry.net. But I would more like to pass along a process for how to do it, right? Like a 4-step process. So the first step, anytime you're going to do biomimicry, is quiet human cleverness. And that's a big one for us. It's hard for us to do that now with our big brains, but yeah, quiet human cleverness. And then
meaning make that cleverness quiet, so we're not
quiet
trying
it.
Yeah, so we can listen as opposed to
dial that down.
Yeah.
And then the second one is listen. So whether you're reading about it on asknature.org, you're reading about an organism, or whether you're outside with a question on your lips going, well, how does nature do that? Listen. So quiet human cleverness, listen. Echo what you hear. That's the emulation part. And then the fourth part is give thanks. And back to our indigenous ancestors who did know how to do those 4 steps. And the giving thanks was in a very real way. Maybe it was tobacco at the corners of your tent as an offering back, or a thank you for the organism that allowed itself to be taken that day and harvested, right? That thank you that used to be a big part of our cultural norm has to come back. And
it used to be a big part of our life, like in general. That was a just as real part of life as going to actually hunt or going to do whatever.
Yeah.
So could you repeat those?
Yeah.
They're
So
quiet
it's
human cleverness.
yeah, if you want to, yeah, if you want to sort of ask something of the natural world and get it and get an idea, a new idea for what it is you're trying to solve, Um, quiet human cleverness, listen, echo what you hear, and give thanks.
And on the topic of, I mean, it obviously in America, the native people, and then also all over the world. Before, I think in your book, you also mentioned the ag revolution sort of being the impetus of the going away from that sort of
Yeah.
instinctual biomimicry.
Or kind of fall from grace.
Yeah, more or less. I think I can't remember the book, but I heard the agricultural revolution describe, or like the essence of the agricultural revolution was to increase lifespan while decreasing quality of life as it relates to humans, which is interesting to think about.
Wow.
Interesting to think about. What sort of things? Because I mean, last night we were talking about the black feet, I believe, and how they are sort of not leading the way, but what we can learn from them in terms of what they know and instinctively have done.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of those things as it relates to like the native people in America that we can learn from as it relates to interacting with environment?
Yeah. There's an amazing book called Tending the Wild, which reminds us of it's a well-researched book about indigenous tribes in what is now California and how much they did interact with the land and actually shaped it. So a lot of what we see in North America was shaped by beavers. That was one of the organisms that was really a keystone species and a niche creator, but also Native Americans who used to burn certain areas, right? Releasing ash, releasing nutrients, and also creating grasses that the herds that they hunted with and on would have something to eat. So there was management through fire management. There was a lot of underplanting of needed, so there were food forests, for instance, so you would plant food plants under forests. As you were moving, you would be able to, if you were migrating from one valley to another, you'd be able to get food along the way that you had planted or that you had helped to distribute or propagate. In a sense, there was some propagation. It's not the kind of agriculture we think of, which was like, disking the soil up kind of agriculture. But for instance, my there's a woman named writer named Robin Wall Kimmerer who writes a book called Braiding Sweetgrass that is very good. It's about braiding indigenous knowledge together with she's a scientist and also a Potawatomi indigenous woman. She's very cool. Anyway, she told me a story about, and this is an approach to agriculture. It's she told me a story about taking her students. I think she teaches at Syracuse. Taking her students up into wild rice country up in near Minnesota, and a lot of her students were from the engineering departments there or the forestry departments there, and she was taking them with elders canoeing to show them how wild rice is harvested. So they were going out and they had baton kinds of things, and they were hitting the rice, and then it's wild rice, and so it would break, the grains would fall out and into the canoe. So the students were really touched by the fact that the elders had taught them so much, so they thought that they would give back something. So what they did, and because they're engineers, they went and they designed a way to put nets on the outsides of the gunnels of the canoe. And they drew up these designs, and they were very proud to present them and said, This way, you won't lose any of the grains because a lot of the grains were going into the lake around them, into the water around them. And they thought that was super wasteful. So they thought, well, we can improve the productivity here of every canoe ride, and we can give them this design that catches all the rice. And the elders said, well, thank you very much, but please don't build that because we're not going to use it because if we don't do this, who will plant the rice?
So you have to give up a little bit.
They think of themselves as, and I actually think that the wild misses us when we were in that kind of a reciprocal relationship in which, yeah, the rice gave us some, we gave some back to the marsh. And of course, it's not just us getting fed by the rice. It's also, there's ducks that need that rice. Like, who will feed the ducks, right? Who will plant the rice? So to see yourself in that way, can you imagine? And we used to.
That's the human cleverness.
Yes.
Like the nets.
Right. There you go.
That would be, we can make this better. When in reality, perhaps it doesn't need to be made better.
It doesn't. And actually, better if you look at it through the lens of how does life continue here? Does it get richer and richer year on year? How do we enhance this place the way the natural world is always constantly building more soil, making it more fertile, right? Dropping its branches and gosh, it becomes more fertile. Isn't that incredible? And then to have that mutualistic relationship, right? In which you're planting wild rice for the ducks and for your offspring, but that kind of, wow. And I'm helping the rice, harvesting the rice, and helping the rice at the same time propagate itself is, wow.
A lot of lessons.
A lot of lessons.
There's you just mentioned the ability to build soil, to create soil.
Yeah.
I had the opportunity, as you know, to go down to White Oak Pastures in Bluffton, Georgia. Will Harris and Jenny Harris and his other daughter run White Oak Pastures. And he has such an interesting story because he was an industrial farmer, and so was his dad.
Yeah.
He's the 4th generation, and the 6th generation lives on the farm now. But he was an industrial farmer because that's the way he learned. He was learned.
Yeah.
He was taught. So he was the kind of guy, he said, who was, if they told you to use a pound of fertilizer, he's using 3. So he was industrial to the max. And it's a cool story. I mean, we talked about it a little bit last night as well, where they raised cattle to a certain age and they'd ship the cattle on these 2-layer trailers to like Nebraska, I think.
Yeah.
And he had done that probably hundreds and hundreds of times. And for some reason, one day he like kind of looked at it, he's like, hold up, let me like clear my, like, what am I looking at? I'm looking at these cattle that are getting squeezed into, like, they can't move for 30-hour drive.
Yeah.
There's cattle on top of other cattle. So they're peeing and pooping on top of these cattle.
Yeah.
And they're just stuck. They can't sit down. They can't lay down. And he's like, which is interesting. Oof. His first thought was, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm not doing that anymore.
Wow.
So it's like, I don't know where I'm going to go, but I know I'm not doing that.
Yep.
And so I asked him how that kind of came about to regenerative ranching. And he's been on the forefront very much so.
Yeah.
In terms of regenerative ranching and sort of flipping that paradigm. But it wasn't so much, what am I going to do? Which is interesting because I'm just now thinking about how this relates to what you just said. Wow, this is cool. Mm-hmm. He was quieting his human cleverness. It wasn't, hey, what am I going to do? Because I asked him, what did you do?
Yeah.
He's like, it wasn't that. That's the wrong question. It was, I didn't ask what I was going to do. I stopped doing things. I stopped doing things I had been doing.
Yes. And so, listen.
Exactly. And then he's like, well, how does nature do it? How does a natural field have however many different types of grasses? And how does a chicken get its food? It pecks, which helps do this to the soil, and a cow grazes, and a hog wallows, and all this stuff. So it works together. So using those 4 principles, it kind of I would love to hear y'all have a conversation together, because I know, because he used biomimicry in his conversation with Rogan, and me and my dad were listening, and we're like, oh wait, that's so cool.
Yeah.
But it's just interesting to hear now that I'm putting these pieces together.
Yeah.
That it wasn't what he was going to do. It's what he was going to stop doing that he was doing that was making the problem.
Human cleverness.
Exactly. So he quieted that, and then he said, what does nature do?
Yeah.
Okay, well, nature, it's not monocrop.
Yeah.
There's tons
That's
of
right.
different things. The other thing that's worth mentioning is like the process that's been. It's not like you just wake up one day and your farm that you've been living on or interacting with over a certain period of time.
Yeah.
It takes time for nature to correct itself,
That's right.
but you have to
That's
start.
right. You do.
And there's a very famous video of, the reason I brought all this up is the soil. There's a famous video of his farm in massive rainfall, and the runoff it looks just like a sort of like a murky river, but you could tell it's like brown water,
Yeah.
dark, very dark.
I think I've seen that.
And then his neighbor is like bright red, muddy.
Yeah.
Because there's no topsoil.
There's no topsoil. That's right.
That's right. But then you look at him and then Joel Salatin and
Polyface Farm.
Yeah, all these. There's a couple other big names that I'm forgetting.
Gabe Brown.
Yeah. Dirt to Soil, I think is his book.
Yeah.
But how you can actually build topsoil. It doesn't have to be take away. And then you look at White Oak Pastures as an example. They're I'm pretty sure they're carbon negative, and they create their own compost. They have this huge compost facility that they move around on the farm every year. It's just really cool to see.
So incredible.
It's inspiring.
And there's plenty of room for humans to participate in that kind of innovation. But it's just that his we use these questions too, which are, what would nature do here? The word here is supremely important.
It's not what would nature do.
It's what would nature do here, because the earth is not monolithic. And so it's to fit form to function and to fit form to place, right? To be attuned to place and to fit in, you really have to understand what would nature do here. And then the other question is, what wouldn't nature do here? And I think that's what Will was also really, nature wouldn't do this, Then the last question is, it's a mentorship question. So what would nature do here? What wouldn't nature do here? Why and why not? So it's like when you have a mentor at work, you get there you're there for like a month, and there's a lot of questions about and you go into your mentor and you say, this just happened. Why? Or why aren't we doing this? Like, you learn the ropes, you sort of learn. Well, as you're a biomimic, and Will certainly is as a farmer and land steward, you learn more and more about why the organisms on that place are behaving the way they are. And you learn why they are not doing certain things too, because droughts come or floods come. And why would you want to, and it's I had a similar experience with, my partner and I have 8 acres in Western Montana, and it was really beat up when we bought it, it's what we could afford.
Yeah.
It was 34 years ago. And it was completely 100% Russian spotted knapweed. It was weeds. There were 2 1-acre ponds. There was no open water.
Wow.
And we said to the realtor, yeah, we'll take it. He said, do you want to see the house? I mean, we just sort of saw this piece of land and went, I bet we can, and my partner's a plant pathologist and forester as well. So we started our long journey, 34-year journey of being on the healing team. Mm-hmm. I mean, we didn't do anything heroic, but we were on the healing team for that piece of ground. And part of the healing team was to try to emulate mob grazing, which used to happen in the Ponderosa Parkland and the grasslands where I am in my valley at about 3,500 feet in Western Montana. There were ungulates that, big herds of elk and other organisms that were eating grasses and that were working the land. And so how do we emulate that and buffaloes at one point? Well, how do we emulate that? Those mob grazing kinds of things. How do we, because the native grasses that we replaced the Russian spotted knapweed after 12 years of goats and all kinds of other cool things, and a lot of broadcast seeding of native seeds, we realized, the natives that we're putting in actually evolved with buffalo eating them or with ungulates eating them. And can we use cows in a similar way. So we brought in cows from an organic dairy nearby for about 30 days a year. And but before the dairy, we had this young man. He was your age, and he wanted to have a herd of cattle, and he had no land, so he wanted to grow a herd. He had a few cows, a few yearling cows, and so he started to move them out. He had 20 or 30, and he'd put a few on a different pieces of land. We had one of them. It was Jeremy Maines. And one time we were sitting having some tea after he brought the cows over, and I just got talking to him about. I said, "Do you, when do you harvest your cows for your family? When do you how many cows a year do you usually put in your freezer, and when do you harvest them?" And he said, and before that we were talking about he listens to the ag commodity stuff every day, and he says, and that's how I decide when to put my cows onto trucks to go to Chicago stock feed yards or onto trains, because that's what we do. And then we plump them up with grain, and then we ship them back in little packages to Montana. Okay. Literally crazy.
Yeah.
Incredibly crazy.
Yeah.
Right.
But that's no fault of his own.
But this is how it was doing. So I was asking him a question about, when do you know to put your cows on the train? And he said, well, I'm always looking at the how much they're worth right now, and this and that, and there's the margin and stuff. And so it's a very particular day that has to do with the commodity prices. And then I got to asking him, like, when do you harvest your cows for your family? And he says, oh, well, I harvest them for my family when the meat is good, when it's ready. I said, oh.
There's a difference.
There's a difference. I said, well, could you do that here? Because we have a mobile butcher that'll come out and actually butcher an animal right.
Very cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. And then we have slaughterhouses, because we have a hunting culture and there's enough slaughterhouses, so we don't have to do the whole. I said, I don't want you to send these cows back, or any cow that you choose for me. I want you to graze them on grass. I don't want them, I don't want them finished in a Chicago stockyard, for goodness sakes, in a feedlot. I said, but then I want it to be when the time is right. And I said, and by the way, I bet if I could email my friends right now, I could sell all those right now, this afternoon. And he said, to who? To them? I said, yeah, we could go to Hamilton Packing. We could have it just, take the meat and give it to my friends after butchering it here or wherever, he was just like, so that's what he started to do.
Very cool.
That's what he started to do. But it had that moment of, why is it that you do something for your family that seems so right when the meat is sweetest, when it's good, when it's ready?
It's intuitive.
It's intuitive. And then you have this whole other thing for the industrial commodity thing, where you're watching the radio every day, listening to the radio for when to get the maximum dollar amount, right? And so he gets a lot more money in his pocket. He's not the last person to get paid. And
you don't have to ship.
Right.
All the way there and all the way back.
And our friends have freezers.
Yeah.
We're Western Montana.
I said this last night, but one of my favorite things that I learned from Will Harris was the sort of paradigm or reframe that he went from, because he did that exact same thing. Literally would grow them, ship them, and then they get shipped wherever. To a feedlot, grass-fed, hormones, antibiotics, all this stuff.
Or corn-fed, not grass-fed.
Yeah, corn-fed.
Fed corn, which they don't even eat.
Yeah, exactly. He went from a minuscule fraction of a supply chain that his farm produced and sold one product, and it wasn't a finished product.
Yeah.
So you think about what that does to a community.
Right.
There's no money coming back into the community.
Yep.
What he does now is he is an entire supply chain, a small one, but he's an entire supply chain. The general store has hundreds of products: beef tallow, soaps, dog collars, dog treats, candles, you name it. And they also have ground beef, beef organs, all that stuff. They have a restaurant that they feed the community with.
So cool.
Their farm employs 180 people. There's 105 or 110 people that live in the town. So all that money is not going to Nebraska or to
it's not
Atlanta.
leaking out of the system.
Exactly. It's staying there.
It's staying there.
Which is remarkable.
And it's more humane for the animals. I mean, when you have a mobile butcher, they walk up to the animal, right? And dispatch the animal. But the animal's calm.
Mm-hmm.
The
Instead
animal's
of being
really
on a
calm.
train or
it's
something.
Super humane. The alternative, right, is all of that adrenaline racing through the animal as it's in that double-decker. Can you imagine? Then on a train, then in a feedlot, just
eating
terror.
Yeah, it's awful.
Terror for the animal. The beef is better when it doesn't have all that stress hormone in it. It's better for us too.
Yeah.
And it's better for the animal. The animal lives its life grazing, and then very, very humanely.
He says, he always refers to it as the animals must, or he must allow the animals to be able to express instinctive behavior.
Yeah.
Which is perfect. So you think about eating corn off of the ground of a feedlot or off of a trough. That's not what cows do. They don't do that. Right?
No.
Same thing with just the whole thing, how they'll cycle their poultry and their hogs and their cattle to the point where they'll do like before and after pictures of pastures, and then the pastures will look better when all of them are done at the end of the cycle. It's awesome. It's very inspiring. That's agriculture.
Yeah.
Is there so what would be like the main fields that biomimicry can be employed in? Because there's agricultural biomimicry, and then what would be the other ones? I guess design would be one.
Design, engineering, chemistry, material science we've talked about. But now there's also biomimicry at the ecosystem level is really this exciting thing that I'm working on with your dad. And we have this thing we have a company called Biomimicry 3.8. That's our for-profit company. Our nonprofit is biomimicry.org. It's the Biomimicry Institute. And then we have, we teach a Master's of Science in undergrad and an 18-month course at Arizona State University. So those are the places you can find us and plug in.
The fields that you can use biomimicry in: engineering, chemistry.
So any realm of human endeavor, you can look to the natural world. I don't think you can look to the natural world for your morals or your ethics. There will always be ethicists. This is not the place to, right? We did that, and it was called eugenics. So you have to be very, very careful that you choose the right model. So, for instance, we are not lions. So to model ourselves socially after lions or after ants or after bees, that doesn't make any sense. You have to pull up and look at things at say, an ecosystem level. So one of the cool things that we're doing now is designing at the level of a building and its site, all the way up to a city, all the way up to a region. And what we're saying is, okay, what would a biomimetic city look like? A biomimetic city would function like the wildland next door. Meaning, and then you say, well, how does an ecosystem function? What do you mean by that? An ecosystem that's healthy cleans water, cleans air. Like air comes into a forest, it leaves cleaner. There's wildlife that's getting born all the time and migrating out. There's all these waves of goodness coming out of a healthy ecosystem.
It's funny how they take all this bad stuff and then it's just
cleaned and purified. But then what's really interesting is it's sent downwind and downstream. So it's this abundance spring, like this pump of abundance, okay? That's always, and that's how you know, actually, as an ecologist, that a system is healthy. It's by the outcomes, these beneficial benefits, right? These ecological benefits that it's able to produce. The soil just keeps getting better. The nutrients, it cycles nutrients for us. It creates microclimates. It cools the air for us, right? All of that And you hear me saying it cools the air for us. We ask the question, what are we doing in return? How do we in a city return the favor? Well, by being a biomimetic city, you would actually set for yourself design goals. So let's do it at the level of a building and its site. And we're actually working with companies like Microsoft and Google and people who are building large,
massive
buildings. And they have sites, and Ford Motor Company. And in our Project Positive, basically we say, okay, you're building on 100 acres, your corporate campus, and some of it is going to be, landscaping. Most people are just going to put in little turf skirts around the buildings, right. And what if instead the building and its site perform the same ecosystem services, they're called, as the wildland next door? So what we do is we actually go and we measure a reference habitat. We say, okay, this many gallons of water are stored every year. This much carbon's sequestered. This much nutrient is cycled. This much noise is buffered. This much wildlife habitat is created to support wildlife. And these are things you can actually measure. We use this really cool ecological modeling tool. It's just amazing. It's an iPad-enabled app. We go and we measure the landscape attributes of the place. It's like you look up and you're like, okay, you've got this much canopy above us. And that means that in this part of the world, because it's geolocated, you're looking at a Google satellite map essentially. And in this part of the world, that means there's this much cooling going on. So then you go to the building site next door that you're going to build on or that you're going to retrofit. And you say, okay, how can we create this much cooling? Well, we need to somehow get shading. We could either plant trees. We can do solar awnings in the parking lot. We can get rid of the parking lot because we have to filter. We have to filter water and we have to store water. How are we going to do that? Well, you can't have an giant asphalt parking lot because you've got to now do these. And when I say got to, it's like it's a design aspiration. And the design team says, okay, with the building, what can we do with the building? It's really cool. We have a great example of it. It was the U.S. Coast Guard building. And this was working with a company called HOK. And they looked at the biological research we had done for that area. And one of the things it said, the Coast Guard they cared a lot about water. And so for them, an ecosystem service that would be very meaningful, they protect our coasts, is to protect water. So they were on a sloped site. This is outside DC. And there's water coming into the site from up above and like usually buried in a culvert, in a pipe. That water, daylighting that water, what they did was instead of building, 2 tall towers, office towers, they basically created a series of roof lines, terraced flat roofs going down the slope. And each one of those roof lines, each flat roof that was offset a little from the one above it, was filled with a wetland.
Wow.
So water comes up above. It goes into the first green roof. It's a green and blue roof. There's wetland species there, particular kinds of wetland species. And we modeled it on how beavers basically do this in a watershed, creating these little purification ponds. So there's this wetland of green plants, and then the water cascades down to the next roof line and over to the next roof line and then over to the next roof line, all through these series of plants. And then it goes into a lake down below. And everybody in the building has a view of the greenery.
Which is awesome.
And the building purifies water.
And it's a part of it's literally a part of the ecosystem. It's a part of
the ecosystem. It's functionally indistinguishable from the ecosystem next door. It
Wow.
functions like it. That's biomimicry.
That's cool. And people can look that up if you just look up Coast Guard
US
office.
Coast Guard building.
That's awesome.
Yeah, look it in Google.
That's
Google.
really
And
cool.
from above, it just looks green. And it's beautiful.
Yeah.
And there's a lake down below then. And that kind of thing. So then the other things you can do is like, okay, I have to support habitat. Okay, maybe I can put niches or perches for hawks to nest, right? I can build them right into the building. Or maybe I want to support pollinators because that's what an ecosystem does, right? It supports pollination. So I put in plants that pollinators like, right? So once you start designing this way, and there's about 21 ecosystem services, and even growing food is an ecosystem service. Like that's what all ecosystem services are what these natural landscapes do for us, right? How they increase our health and well-being just by doing what they do, right? And we're just now saying, why don't we do the same thing and return the favor?
Yeah, why don't we use what they're doing and then which gives them something back?
It gives them something back.
Wow, that's awesome.
Giving thanks.
I'm excited to go look up the have you ever listened to Joe Rogan at all?
Yeah.
Okay, he's got the guy Jamie who's like, Jamie, can you pull that up? And they've got a big old TV.
Yeah.
I want to look at the Coast Guard office right now, but that sounds awesome.
Yeah.
The one thing that I am curious about from a consumer's perspective, I'm not in the design field. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a biomedic or biomimic.
Yeah.
What could somebody like myself do? Like, how can I be? How can I use what you gathered in the field of biomimicry to? How can I implement that into my life?
Yeah. Well, you asked about realms of human endeavor, and it's anything, if you are a designer, but I think everybody's designing something. You're designing a life, right? You're making a whole bunch of choices, right? And there's a new, every few years, there's a new sort of lobe of biomimicry that comes up. And the new one that's really coming up these days is biomimicry for social innovation. And what that means is that there are things that we can learn from ecosystems and how they knit themselves together, how these organisms interact, that can help us as humans knit together a society, right, that we want to live in. And so there are things like the questions, instead of how does nature filter salt from water, it's how does nature communicate? Looking at communication best practices. How does nature cooperate? And what's the difference between cooperation and competition? How does nature create trusted partnerships called mutualisms? So we actually, as biologists, are actually able to go to the literature now and begin to see the best practices, say, of a mutualist. That's just basically a partnership where you are reciprocal. And there are like a fungi in a tree, they're giving
or like
each other stuff.
The sharks that have those little tiny fish swim next to them and clean them off and
the
stuff
remora.
like that.
Yeah, exactly. There's a mutualism. So what are the best practices there? How do they get into that mutualism? How do they learn to trust each other? What are the sort of the etiquette of a mutualism? Like how do you avoid cheating? How do you make sure everybody's like pulling their own weight? How does all of that work? We study those things, and then we now are working with companies to, when they merge, like when Jacobs and CH2M Hill merged, I went and talked about mutualisms to the two company heads because they were now forming a partnership. And what does true partnership look like? It's mutualistic. It's not better for one than the other. It's a net benefit for both. Mm-hmm. And how do you foster that in a company? So there's all kinds of, beyond the technical, there are all kinds of things you can learn from the natural world if you pick the right sort of model scale, right? So from that if you look across the tree of life at communication strategies, for instance, and one of the ways you can find those quickly is the Institute, the Biomimicry Institute, which is biomimicry.org. We've created we said, let's organize the world's biological information by function. So you can type in, how does nature communicate? And up will come examples of communication in the natural world best practices. How does nature, handle compressive forces if you're an architect, So that's called asknature.org. And that's another good way to start. We also there's lots of learning things online. There are courses, depending on where you are in your schooling, from middle school all the way up through university. You can take courses online. You can take a week-long immersion. We go all over the world, all the way up to a 2-year master's course, which is at Arizona State University.
How long has that been going on?
We've been teaching. We had to train the biologists at the design table. So, and we've been teaching now, now it's engineers join and communications people join and anybody who wants to add biomimicry to their career. And at Arizona State, we've probably been doing that now for 7 years. Is an
That's great.
accredited course. Like you get your master's of science in biomimicry. And then people who we graduate go on to, like for instance, Caitlin Chusey is a graduate of ours. She's now the director of biomimicry at Microsoft.
Wow.
So it's starting to be a profession. But it's also, take a 3-hour self-paced course.
Yeah.
Or watch TED Talks. There's tons of TED Talks. It's a whole.
Yeah, you've
it's
got
a
a
fun
couple
world.
TED Talks that are
I've got 3.
Yeah,
Yep.
3 that are great.
Thank you.
One thing that I always come back to, like when I've asked that question to other people that are in certain fields that I'm more removed from, at least immediately. I'm not like in the trenches like you yourself are in biomimicry or what have you, but I am a staunch believer in our dollar being as or more important than our vote. I think that what we spend, what we give our money to, like what we as consumers, because I really do think that when you think about business in general, it really is it's a race to please the consumer as a whole. And if the consumer, myself, say, you know what, I know that this company is taking steps to mimic nature, mimic life, and be nature positive, then I'll support that company.
Yeah.
Or if this company's just blatantly not doing that, or if this company's doing this, then not supporting that company, and so on and so forth. Because what in essence what that's doing is you're giving energy to one or the other, and what does not get energy dies.
That's exactly right.
So is there any way to like look up or how can we learn about companies that are taking those steps? Is there a sort of an index that we can go to?
Yeah, absolutely. inasknature.org, that database of solutions that I talked about. There's a whole category called innovations. And that's where you'll see all the case studies that you and I have talked about, impossible materials and all of that. They're in there. And we run this Ray of Hope prize. If you have an innovation, by the way, or an idea that's biomimetic, we have something called the Launchpad to help you get it commercialized, or the Ray of Hope prize, which is we award the best biomimicry startups in the world. And we've been getting 300 applications a year to that. So there's a lot of biomimetic companies out there. And so look at the innovation pages on Ask Nature. Go to our YouTube channel, the Biomimicry Institute's YouTube channel. We have these cool 3-minute animated shorts of each of the 30 companies we've awarded in the last 3 years. And those are really cool things that you can buy. And that you start to support, because I believe in what you're saying as well. You're an agent of natural selection. Your money makes a choice that keeps something alive while something else fades away. So you're an agent of natural selection. That's a way of rewarding the right things.
That's incredible. The last question I have for you is because obviously there's all these great things, and everything has challenges, everything has roadblocks or impediments that are stopping them from, or not stopping them, but maybe slowing down their growth. Not that it's wrong. I think everything comes in due time. But what are the biggest challenges that you and anybody's facing right now implementing biomimicry?
Yeah. Well, biomimicry faces the biomimetic inventions face whatever the same challenges other inventions face. Like there's the valley of death in the innovation process. And you've got a great idea, you've got a prototype, you get a little bit of seed funding, and then there's this thing called the valley of death, right? And everybody's got to cross that, biomimetic or not. There was, when we started 26 years ago now, it seemed strange to people. It wasn't a normal thing to to learn from the natural world. I mean, that was not, nobody had that on their spreadsheet of, yes, let's hire some biomimics today,
Yeah.
right? That was, in other words, the design professions, and I mean big D design, designing everything, making our world, they have through time pulled up a chair to the design table. So a while ago it was, let's think about user interface, right? Let's have a psychologist at the design table, or an ergonomics specialist at the design table if we're going to make something for the human body, right? And now we're adding another chair, the biologist at the design table. And so if people are not used to that, that can be a barrier. What's interesting is that you asked about, like, what are these big case studies? And we really need those to come out so that everybody can point to it and go, how was that invented? Oh, that's that biomimicry thing, right? And that's, I mean, one of them is huge for human health. For instance, it's called sharklet technologies. So it's based on the denticles of a shark, and it's a thin film that you put on hospital, surfaces. And it repels bacteria. They don't like to land on it. They don't like to land on Galapagos sharks. So all he did was, it's like Lotus effect. They just mimicked that blueprint. It's called sharklet.
Wow.
That's a huge thing because it doesn't breed for resistance, because it doesn't kill the bacteria.
It just
repels
doesn't allow it to land on it.
They don't like to land on it. So those sorts of things are, I think, have huge potential impacts for here's one in the health thing. And you asked about barriers. Sometimes the barriers are just this sort of cotton in our ears. The fact that we don't, or scales on our eyes, that we don't see these organisms as teachers. I'll give you a perfect example. So COVID. So while we're still looking at, where COVID comes from, we know that bats, the Asian bats were shedding virus, right? And maybe they shed some of that in our markets. So everybody in those open air markets, everybody freaked out about the fact that there was spillover. It's called spillover from these bats. And then I began to see all kinds of negative anti-bat stuff. Let's just kill the bats. Let's get rid of those bats. The bat has lived with coronavirus for 40 million years. So there were a small group of scientists studying how they handle living with and having levels of coronavirus all the time in their systems. Now that sounds like something we might want to look into, right?
We could learn from.
How do bats, how have they learned to calm their immune system, their immune response, so that there's not such a storm, the cytokine storm? What is going on in bats? So when I tell audiences that, they kind of gasp because they should have had a V8. Like, oh, yeah, that makes so much sense. So the barrier might be just in that we don't see them with the respect that I saw them with, that I learned to see them with as a young girl. You know what I mean? Like that literally, that lack of respect may keep us from learning something that will keep us alive in a world of increasing spillovers, right? So it's cultural.
Yeah.
The biggest barrier.
And I mean, in 26 years, I'm sure you've noticed an incredible amount of growth too. So it's like momentum is building for sure.
That's right.
It's got to be cool to see. I mean, you've got TED Talks with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of views. Biomimicry's becoming, there's a head of the biomimicry at Microsoft and things of that sort. I mean, how does that feel to see, like,
it's incredible to have it not be a word, to biomimicry and its synonyms, something like 98 million hits in Google come up now. There's millions and millions. I mean, the Vox explainer, I don't know, that's up to 11 million hits or something. There is every year I can't even keep up with all the people doing PhD theses in biomimicry and studying biomimicry as a topic area.
Wow.
You know, the philosophy of biomimicry. A book just came out, the Biomimicry Revolution. It's a philosophy book about the philosophy of learning from nature. You know, what does it mean in terms of the history of science and technology? There's people not only doing biomimicry, in other words, there's hundreds of thousands of people working in this field. And then there's a bunch of people just saying, this is an inflection point in our culture, which is what I see, is that when we begin to, we in Western industrial culture, when we begin to return and to look to the natural world for our guidance and for best practices, that changes our relationship to the rest of the natural world. And suddenly we get closer to those indigenous tribes that you talked about, the Blackfeet, living with the bison, with great respect for those bison, by the way. Great respect for those bison, right? We're getting closer to that when we get that kind of, because believe me, I work with biomimics. I work with scientists who have learned from biomimics, and they are so reverential about the organisms they study. And then once a biomimic, always a biomimic. They invent one thing using biomimicry, and then they just keep using biomimicry over and over again, because the library of ideas is, you know, we have at least 10 to 30, maybe even more, million species, right? We've only named about 1.7 million, but
Wow.
we have a lot of species out there. So the thing that really excites me, and that excites a lot of young people going into this field, is that it's wide open exploration. There is so much we can learn from these organisms just in the nick of time, because the one thing they've learned how to do is life creates conditions conducive to life. And they've figured out how to do it. And so there's just people lining up to say, yeah, I'm ready to sit down with my notebook and figure out how to do this too.
Which
right?
is great.
Which is great. Which is great.
That's awesome. Well, we're pushing the 2-hour mark.
Okay.
Janine, thank you so much. I mean, fascinating conversation. Biomimicry, the book, biomimicry.org, asknature.org.
Yep.
If you want to go to Arizona State
Yep.
and get a degree, go ahead.
Yeah, or
YouTube,
online even.
Janine Benyus, or
And
Biomimicry on YouTube. You can find TED Talks, all those.
Biomimicry.net is our nonprofit, our for-profit, excuse me.
Very
Yep,
cool.
our consultancy.
Thank you so much. I mean, this is fascinating to me. I've been hearing about biomimicry, obviously, my dad for a long time.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, it was very cool to hear the word biomimicry on Joe Rogan's podcast, which is the biggest
awesome.
podcast, biggest media platform in the world, or at least
Is
in
it
the West.
really?
Oh, he's
Oh,
like
my goodness.
millions and millions of
Oh,
people
my
that listen to
goodness.
every one of his podcasts.
Well, you know, I gotta put in a little plug for your dad. So Monty Wilson is Nolan's dad, and works at Jacobs, landscape architecture background. I met him many years ago. We've been working together for almost 20 years.
Wow.
Met him at HOK when he was at HOK. And Monty your dad saw biomimicry and said, yeah, this is something we have to bring to the built world, which is one of our largest artifacts, right? Our nests, these built world things, are one of our largest artifacts. It's important. It's important work that he's involved in. The way we're going now, we're probably going to add another 3 billion people to our cities between now and 2050. That means we have to build the equivalent of a city for 1 million every 5 days. So, yeah, just take a deep breath, right? And that's what we're doing. So your dad's in a very, very, very important field. He saw biomimicry. He literally has opened he's a pathfinder species. He has opened so many doors and so many channels for this to flow where it needs to flow. History will mark him as one of the people that not only allowed, but helped biomimicry enter into the places where it matters most and where we make our world. Seriously.
He'll be pleased to hear that, because I'm
Yeah.
sure he'll listen to this. That's incredible.
Absolutely.
He'll be very
And he knows it too. He's very strategic. Your dad's very strategic.
He'll be very pleased to hear that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Again, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. Thank you for hosting me the last couple of days as well. That was a very, very cool experience.
You bet.
It's cool to just be around y'all and hear what y'all are talking about. But thank you, Janine. I really appreciate it.
You are so welcome, Tyro.